Hi guys, I am taping for Professor Wolfley right now for her Women in Crime and Vice and Prostitution class. She asked me very kindly if I would lecture about politics of crime, specifically crime involving child abuse and sexual assault. So let's see. Because, as I've a story that I've told in some lectures already, um, I was raped by my father and my uncle as a child when I was 22, right before I turned 23, and was locked out of any type of justice by the New York statute of limitations for child sex abuse. Um, was it? I made the decision that I was not going to have charges pressed on my father. When I was 24, I found out that he had molested another little kid. And this has been an ongoing source of strife and guilt and all sorts of things for my life. Um, now I'll give you a little bit of a background. I majored in biochemistry when I was in college because I did not want anything to do with child abuse in any way, shape, or manner, ever. I did not ever want to tell anybody that I was a survivor. I did not ever want to meet another survivor. I did not want anything to do with that ever again. I did not want anyone to ever realize I was a survivor. This was just, I figured, part of my life that was going to go, and the door was going to close, and I would be okay, and that's the only way I could be okay. So that's not how it works, but I didn't know that then. So when I was in college, though, I did take some sociology classes, and I learned about Dr. David Olds and the work he did with coming up with the concept of primary prevention of child abuse, which is basically looks at attachment of mothers to children and looks at saying, if a mother doesn't attach well to with her child, this child is likely to be abused. We can do things. We can identify the mothers who are likely to struggle attaching. We can help them nurture these attachments, and look, it works. And these children do not get abused, and these children grow up and live good lives, and all the bad things associated with child abuse. And by this point, you know all that, all of the crime and et cetera, poor health outcomes. I hope by this point in your careers you've heard of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that quantifies just how horrible the health outcomes are for kids who are abused or experience certain other things like parental domestic violence, mental illness, drug addiction, incarceration. All of those things are comparable to child abuse in terms of the outcomes they have later in life. So, the one thing I will say about Dr. Olds and the studies and the programs he came up with was it was not geared towards the prevention of sexual abuse. It was geared towards the prevention of non-sexual abuse. Why? It's much, much, much easier to study non-sexual abuse. If a kid is beaten, they have bruises. There's very visible things going on. If a kid is neglected, they're losing weight. They're not hitting their cognitive milestones, their developmental milestones. That stuff is very obvious, so it's very easy to study. Studying the prevention of sexual abuse is much harder because it takes decades for survivors to disclose on average. So, at any rate, there's still this huge body of data. By the time I was in college, mid-90s, it was huge. The studies had been going on for a little bit longer than I had been alive. And it proved, look, here we can prove that child abuse is preventable. And lo and behold, we're not doing it. We're not investing in these programs don't exist. So, or then they exist, but they exist in a very small capacity. So that really moved me. That was actually very painful for me. That was almost re-victimization for me. It was just like I'd learned that my family didn't really care that I was being sexually abused, oh look, neither does the rest of the world. That wasn't a great thing to cope with and to acknowledge, but it was reality. And I did emerge from college optimistic enough that I wanted to change that. So I got out of college. I graduated in '99. There was a very strong job market then, which I know you guys are going to hear that and think of, I might as well have been in the days of the dinosaurs, but there actually was, at one point in recent memory, a strong job market for fresh college grads. So I graduated, I got a good job, I was financially independent. I'm like, okay, I do need to start doing something to help with child, okay, to help with the prevention of child abuse. That is really something I want to do. This is important to me. So I got involved with one organization called Prevent Child Abuse New York, go figure, and one of the things they got me involved in doing was legislative advocacy, aka lobbying. I hate telling people that I lobby. They look at you like I just said I euthanize puppies for fun. Lobbying is important. Lobbying is good. Lobbying has its place, especially if you ever pay a lot of attention to politicians and actually figure out what their lives are like. We need lobbyists. The problem is we need some kind of equal access to them on all sides, and that's what we don't have. But at any rate, so I learned a little bit about legislative advocacy, and I was involved in some legislative advocacy for budget issues for child abuse prevention. So, that was great. I did it. I'd go every year. I'd knock on some doors and hand out some flyers and talk a little bit. And it was great. Nothing happened. The programs in the, I don't know, 6, 7 years I was doing that, the programs did not grow very much. In good economic years, they'd grow a little bit. When the economy wasn't good, they wouldn't grow at all. Politicians saw this as something like, oh, this is just fluff. This is just a nice little thing we can do to make ourselves look good when there's money to spare. They didn't understand there's anything crucial about it. Meanwhile, let's see, some of those years were the first time when I was realizing my father was molesting other kids. I was trying to work with the police. It was about the first times that I had ever, when I started having to talk to the police, was about the first time I had ever actually said in so many words that I was sexually abused. I never thought that was a goal. I never wanted to be able to talk about it. I didn't understand why that was desirable. I didn't want to be one of those people who goes around talking to college kids about being sexually abused. I just saw no point to it. I didn't want that to be me. And I didn't tell anybody in the organizations I was with that this was a part of my life, because I didn't see why it was relevant, and I didn't see why it was, I didn't see why there was anything valuable about it. I didn't see how that made me a better board member, a better lobbyist, etc., etc. Finally, at one point, I did eventually get better about it. I was having issues. I was having psychological issues. I did start going online and involving myself in online support groups more and more, and was able to overcome a lot of the traditional survivor issues. I was able to get rid of a lot of the guilt. I was able, which always happens. Survivors always assume the abuse is their fault. As ridiculous as that may sound to somebody who's never been there, it's almost universal in the survivor experience. And as your professor and I were talking about a little bit earlier, most of the time our families do not help. when we do reveal the abuse, very often our families are not helpful, friends are not helpful. A study just came out in December that said two very interesting things. One is that it takes sexual abuse survivors, an average of 21 point something years before they're able to start talking about the abuse. And the other is that most of the time when a child does disclose during their childhood, it is not a positive experience. Those are pretty interesting things to keep for you guys to commit to memory. Keep that in mind. But at any rate, so there's a lot of guilt and shame associated with being a survivor. I was I'm working through support groups. I was kind of getting over that. From one of the groups I was involved with, I was tasked. My name was given to another local woman who wanted to organize an event for survivors to tell their stories. The group Prevent Child Abuse New York did not realize that I was a survivor at this point. They just handed me this task because I lived in Rochester and so did this other woman. So I sent this woman an email, and in the email I mentioned I'm a survivor too, because it's so much easier to email this to people than it is to say it. And then, she's emailing me back, and at some point in the conversation, she's like, okay, let's get together and meet, and we'll start talking about this event. And I'm like, damn it, now she knows this thing about me. I'm going to meet her face to face. And it was one of the first times I had ever met a survivor face to face who I knew was a survivor. And she was an incest survivor. She was abused by her stepfather. A story, she's an incest survivor. All stories are very similar and very different at the same time. It was a really positive, really interesting and positive experience for me to all of a sudden be around someone who identified themselves as a survivor. That had never really happened to me before. And so, we'd talk. A very small percentage of what we spent talking about was our own abuse. Mostly we were trying to get this event organized, and we were trying to talk about, all sorts of other things. And we'd go and we'd get coffee, and we'd meet over at coffee shops and stuff like that. And it helped me realize that, your story can fall into a bigger, broader context of your life. Here's this person who seems pretty well adjusted. She's got her issues, but she seems pretty well adjusted, and she's a survivor, and she knows that I am, and this is interesting. And so we organized this event. The event is Speak Out Rochester, which I know I've talked about in an earlier taping, and we are still having it all these years later. We organized the event. It went off pretty well. The second year, somebody from Prevent Child Abuse New York attended the event, and by this point, I'm like, I can go on that stage. I can tell my story. I know I can, and I will if I have to, because one of the things we realized is that you need to keep a flow going in the event. If there's that empty stage and nobody is on it, nobody is just going to come on it. They need to see somebody go up there first and talk and not die. And then they go on it. So the woman who was organizing it with me, we said, if I can't come up there, if there's a gap of more than 3 seconds, go up and start talking. So that's what we did. And so then the executive director of Prevent Child Abuse New York soon learned that I'm an incest survivor. And it was, in some ways, the most underwhelming experience of my life to stand on a stage and do this, tell my story and do this thing. It's supposed to be so empowering and everything. And you don't feel different right after that happens. But I had also communicated something to somebody who I had known for years and trusted a little bit. And so that was powerful, and she's a remarkably good person, and we talked later, and so anyway, we talked about it a little bit later, and I just said, this isn't something I put on my resume. Well, the year after that, New York State slashed the budget for child abuse prevention programs. And we were talking about strategies to how to motivate legislators to fix that. And one of the things that came up was, if we could have abuse survivors talking about just how bad it is to be abused, that helps because it makes it less abstract to them. They realize I'm not just cutting a few $1,000,000 out of a budget. I'm ruining somebody's life. I'm sanctioning the ruining of somebody's life. So now my secret is out, and I'm like, okay, fine, I can do this. So I started learning how to use my story for advocacy purposes. And that was really powerful for me because all of a sudden I've gone from being an advocate who who isn't allowed to use everything in their disposal, isn't allowed to use their whole heart and their whole soul, because when you are an abuse survivor, as horrible as this may sound, that's a big chunk of your heart and your soul is touched, damaged, forged, a lot of different ways you can think of this, but is affected by that abuse. If you can't use anything that has been touched by that abuse, you can't use very much. So that's not a good situation. And once I had learned that I can actually use my story for good, that meant I could use everything I had. I could use my whole heart, my whole soul, everything. And that was pretty impressive. That was pretty freeing. And so I started getting a lot better at legislative advocacy and got a lot more interested in it. And I had known every couple of years I'd hear something about New York State was trying to lengthen the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse. And I'd hear about it one year, I wouldn't hear about it for 2 or 3 more years, I just assumed the bill had passed. Finally, I think it was around 2008, 2009, I heard something about it. This bill was still kicking around. I'm like, what in the hell is wrong? Why has this not passed yet? So I started getting more involved with it. And, well, a couple of interesting things happened. When I learned that, finally I started convincing Prevent Child Abuse New York, you guys need to push this. And the first thing I heard of was, we don't see it as a child abuse prevention issue. We see this as a survivor justice issue. So I had to explain that, no, this is a prevention issue because there are people in this world like my father, and statistically like most offenders, who are going to keep offending and offending and offending until they get caught. What happens after they get caught depends a lot on what exactly type of abuser they are and what happens to them. Are they receptive to treatment or not? Are they treated? Are they monitored, etc., etc., etc.? I know more about this than most people on the street, but I'm not an expert by any matter of means. So I'm not going to elaborate much on that. I'm not going to elaborate much on that part. Therapy dog. But so at any rate, I was able, and again, using my story and also the respect that I had earned. I mean, by this point I was getting kind of good at what I was doing, and it was not because I'm a survivor. It was not in spite of being a survivor. It was both. It was because I know what I know, I do what I do, I am who I am. So, we're getting somewhere. I started convincing Prevent Child Abuse New York to just let me run on this. Let me push this. Let me figure out why this bill isn't passing. Let's start talking to people. Let's see what we can do to pass it. And it worked. Eventually, people did understand why I was able to make people understand why this is an issue. And so I started doing some research on this. And what actually is killing the bill, okay, let me back up. Right now in New York, on your 23rd birthday, if you have experienced any sort of sexual abuse, your 23rd birthday, or actually the way it's written in the law, is 5 years after you turn 18. You are no longer allowed to seek any legal recourse. It's done. Your abuser is free. There is no constitutional way to fix that. If the Child Victims Act, which is the name of the bill we're pushing for right now, which would completely eliminate the statute of limitations in New York, if that bill were passed tomorrow, there's still nothing I can do to get my father arrested. It's considered unconstitutional. It's ex post facto. There's just nothing you can do. Okay, fine. What they can do is open what's called a civil window, 1 year or a finite period of time. Some states have had 2 or 3 year windows, but for a finite period of time, victims can pursue their suits in civil court. These can be suits that have been time barred. So if this law were to pass tomorrow, I could sue my father. What would happen if I sue my father? Well, a lot of things. One of them would be, there'd be notices that this is going on. There would be, if I won the suit, there would be a legal piece of paper saying, a judge saying, they believe me. Just that is very therapeutic and healing for a lot of survivors. I know people believe me. My parents even believe, well, my father, we don't care about him. My mother, she knows what happened with my uncle. We've had acknowledgments about that. She knows what happened there. About my father, she has never indicated that she believes me or my sister. I don't care. But I would have documentation saying that this actually happened. His name would be put in a database of abusers who basically are not able, abusers whose victims have been time barred but have been found guilty in civil court. This is what other states have done, and every state that has similar legislation gets more and more sophisticated about this. So that's good. These databases are useful. If he were to want to volunteer to lead a scout troop or something like that, organizations that know what they're doing look through those databases, and they disqualify people for volunteer work or employment with children just the way they would run a background check, or a check with the state's central register of child abusers. So it's useful for that. It's useful to get documentation. One of the stories that would come up when I was in support groups was that women who were abused by their father or stepfather become mothers. Not necessarily from the DNA provided by their abuser, but they tend to have, sexual abuse survivors tend to have major issues with sexuality as adults. Teenage pregnancy is very common, or just having a lot of kids, being unable to care for those kids, relinquishing them to foster care is very common. However, when there are also federal laws that say grandparents have to be notified if a child is about to be relinquished for adoption. When this child's grandparent is your abuser, guess what? They can say, oh, here, I want this child, this is my grandchild, this is my flesh and blood, I'm entitled to raise this child. Yeah, I know this mother is crazy and she's terrible, but, look, but that happens. Everyone knows about some crazy, terrible kid who can't raise their kids. I want a chance to raise this grandkid. if the mother has, if the statute of limitations is closed, there is nothing that mother can do to say, look, no, he did this to me. He therefore cannot be trusted to raise his child. You know, that happens. I've met women who've had that happen, who've had to have their child relinquished to their abuser because realistically they were too involved in drugs, they were too mentally ill, whatever, they couldn't raise this kid. But they also couldn't prove that their abuser couldn't either. They couldn't prove that the abuse happened, so the abuser gets another victim handed to them by the state. These are all just really horrible things that civil suits are useful at preventing. Obviously, civil suits also can result in money changing hands. Most people who sue their abuser most sexual abuse survivors are incest survivors. You'll see statistics that go someplace between 40 and 60% because different scientists define incest differently, whether they refer to it from a purely biological standpoint or take like stepfathers into account, which the relationship is incestuous, but biologically it's not their DNA, so you can argue that it's not. But any rate, incest survivors are the majority of sex abuse survivors. Most of the rest of them are people very close, maybe babysitters, neighbors, family, friends, people who are very close to the family. Smaller percentage are teachers, coaches, etc., etc. 2%, between 2 and 4% of sex abuse survivors are abused by clergy. This is the part of the equation where it gets really ugly, because whereas if I were to sue my father for his chunk of, he's an ordinary person, ordinary assets, much of which he's going to hide, much of which would be eaten up by a lawyer. If the law were to pass tomorrow and I were to sue my father, I don't know, I'd be able to go out to dinner or something if I won. That would be about it. I'd take Professor Jen out with me. that would be it. That's the money. People who have been abused by large institutions like churches, there's a huge case against Yeshiva University that just today it looks like they may be able to go through with that. The case had been turned away by a judge. It looks like they found a way to appeal it as of today. Horace Mann, prep school in New York City. Some of these big institutions have big money attached to them. If survivors have been able to prove that not just a particular teacher, not just a particular priest did this, but if the institution was facilitating it. Some cases like that have resulted in huge multi-million-dollar settlements. Penn State is the one that you guys have probably heard about because it's already happened. Penn State had to pay out millions and millions and millions of dollars to, I don't remember how many, I want to say about 36 survivors, because they knew that the entire universe, that lots of people in the university knew what Jerry Sandusky was doing. They didn't stop him. They had years in which to stop him. They didn't do it. So Penn State was found liable for millions of dollars. These are very rare suits, but they get headlines and they get people scared. And because they get people scared, these scared bodies, and in New York State, in every other state, it is mostly the Catholic Church, I'm going to be honest with you. They hire lobbyists, they muddy the waters, they really fight very nasty to keep this bill from passing. So I really don't care what the Catholic Church thinks or says or does about me and my life. I'm perfectly willing to fight for this bill. It's a bill that most people are very supportive of. When you tell people on the street that because of this bill, between 90 and 97% of sex offenders are walking free. They are horrified. They don't know that fact. When we hear about child sex abuse on TV, what we're hearing about usually is a child who's disclosed their abuse while they are still a child. Probably the abuse didn't happen yesterday, but they are still a child while they're disclosing it. That's all we see, because it's mostly only children who can get justice in the courts. As hard as it is, that's mostly what happens. That means, every time you see a child sex abuse case in which a child is the one who's having charges pressed on their behalf, that's a statistical anomaly. It's happening, like I said earlier, the average age, it takes an average of 21 point something years for a survivor to start talking about their abuse. If you've got a kid who only needs 2 or 3 years before they're talking about it, that means statistically on average you've got somebody else who's going to need 40-some years. That's not uncommon. I know most of the guys I'm lobbying with are A, guys, and B, or most of the survivors, I should say, who I'm lobbying for this bill with, are A, guys, and B, in their 50s, because that's just how long it's taken them to be able to talk about this and to be able to deal with this and to be able to get to the point I'm at now where they can use their whole heart and soul, as damaged as they may be, where they can use it to fight for this. So, yeah, it's that. But we see children, and we see pictures, all these sad pictures of children in courtrooms and children in child advocacy centers, and we think this is what's actually going on. This is how it actually works. No, it's not. You're seeing statistical anomalies, but that's all you're seeing, so it doesn't seem anomalous. But no, you need to be, mostly it is adults who are able to go to the police. And, if you're an adult, you're more likely to be able to go without your family. You're more likely to be able to come about some of the things I talked about with the professor earlier in another taping about just realizing I need to, emotionally, I'm okay to live without my family. I'm okay to live without that. It takes a while. That's not a decision a child can make. It's a decision an adult can. So that's what's going on. That's what needs to happen for so many of these survivors to seek justice. Any rate, it's mostly the bill is mostly being fought by the church. They are portraying this as anti-religious. It's not. They talk about all the bankruptcies that happen because of this bill. Up until this year, when Minnesota passed the bill, I think there had been one bankruptcy of a parish ever that had anything to do with it. I think in Minnesota, a couple of them may actually file. Most people on the street don't really care. Most people on the street see this as a guilty party is having to pay. A guilty party is having to pay money. That's the way life goes. That's the way our criminal justice system goes. That's fine. But therapy dog is back. But Catholic churches don't like that. Catholic politicians don't like that. So it's an issue. This is a very ugly issue. There's a lot of stuff going on about church and state. There's a lot of controversy about how much can a church, which is considered to be a not-for-profit, and as such is limited in what kind of lobbying they can do, should they really be pushing this hard for this bill against a particular political piece of legislation? There's a lot of controversy. This is really an interesting battle. I'm very glad I'm a part of it. I'm overjoyed that I'm a part of it. I've gotten to submit testimony to the Codes Committee hearing on the bill last year. I'm hoping we'll get to do that again this year. I'm doing a lot of lobbying for it. There's an online petition that is going to become available on the Paper Bag Ladies, paperbagladies.org, that your professor kindly runs. You can, if you want, you can read a little bit more about my story, and you can sign the petition if you want. You can help get that pushed throughout the school. That's one thing you can do. This is a very interesting bill. This is going to be the most significant bill about child sex abuse ever once it gets passed, because so few, when we rely on children to incarcerate sex offenders, we're going to miss most of them. There's no way we can't. That's why the statistics are between 90 and 97% of sex offenders right now are walking free. They will never see a day behind bars for their crimes. Adults need to be the people who fight for this, who fight for their own justice. Most kids aren't lucky enough to be able to fight for it, or to have somebody who will fight for them. This needs to be given to adults, and it doesn't do any good with a statute of limitations, so it needs to go. And that's it. I'm very happy that I can be part of fighting against this. I expect I'm going to be doing this for a while, because this is very acrimonious, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. So.
Well, thank you, Miss Melanie, and we wish everybody a wonderful evening, and get our little studio clicked off, and thank you again, and stay safe.